Hi, I'm Chip Hardwick. I'm the executive at the Synod of the Covenant. I want to welcome you to this workshop that we're putting on in partnership with Science for the Church on polarization. I'm so glad that each of you are here in person and here in person by Zoom, and then also all of you that will be watching this later on YouTube. We're grateful for the chance to serve you in this way. And before I turn it over to Drew to introduce our facilitator for today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the life of the Synod. All right. Ed or Drew, do you see that?
We do,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you so much. I want to tell you some of the things we're doing to equip preachers in the Synod. You probably know that we received a Lilly grant for $1.25 million for the Cultivating the Gift of Preaching initiative. This is an initiative that seeks to identify, train, and support emerging preachers, which is code for preachers that haven't had any rigorous theological education, people with a gift of preaching who haven't yet had a chance to be trained for that within the Synod. And applicants can apply now for the cohort. It's an 18-month cohort that starts in June. And so we would love to have people from your congregations or you yourself involved in this. We hope to have many people from throughout the Synod, about 35 people take part this year. And if you are interested in being a mentor for one of our cohort groups, you could also apply. I'm not sure that application is yet on the website, but you could contact me and I would direct you to it when it's ready. Of course, we have our monthly preaching workshop this next February. We have, and Drew, could you let people in as they come?
Yep.
That'd be great. Thank you. In February, it's February, the February workshop, the first Wednesday in February, is Shauna Hannon from the Pacific Lutheran Seminary, scripting a sermon, The Wisdom of Filmmaking for Preaching. She has just written a book about this. And in March, Raj Nadella from Columbia Seminary is preaching in the face of scandalous wealth. And that's the first Wednesday in March. And then we're starting a new ministry actually in February. This is a lectionary discussion group. It sprung from the last preaching workshop. Just at the end, by happenstance, the idea of a lectionary group came up, and there were several people there that were interested. So it will be the second and fourth Wednesdays of the month from 10 to 11:30 a.m. by Zoom. And if you're interested in participating, you could email heather@synodofthecovenant.org to find out the Zoom information. It's too new to be on our website yet, but it will be hopefully by the end of the week. We also are doing some work to equip leaders. The first is our offering of child sexual abuse prevention workshops. This is our boundaries training in 2025. It's required for all teaching and ruling elders by the Book of Order in G 30106. So if you are a teaching or ruling elder, we'd be glad to have you join. This is at no cost to you. The cost is borne by the presbytery and the synod, and here are the dates. These are already on our website, but we'd love to have you take part in one of these workshops. And you need to take part in one of these workshops if you haven't been trained up in this. Another area that we're starting in this month is commissioned ruling elder and commissioned pastors, these Zoom trainings on leadership. The one in February is called Leadership as Process with Dr. Robert McManus of Muskingum University. That's February 19th. And then there's one on emotional intelligence with Reverend Kimberly Ashby. That's February 19th. This is, again, so new, it's not on our website, but you can contact Tim at synodofthecovenant.org for more information, or you can contact me for more information. If you don't already get our newsletter, that's the best way to hear about things like this. Of course, you can go to our website, but the newsletter you can see there. You can also find and follow us on Facebook or subscribe to us on YouTube for programs like this one. The last two polarization workshops are on YouTube, so it would be great to have you watch those, as well as preaching workshops, other opportunities, other things that we do. You can reach me at this phone number and at this email address. No one else listens to my voicemail or reads my email. So if I can be helpful to you in any way, I'd be glad to talk. I'm going to thank you for letting me make those announcements. I want to open us in prayer, and then I will turn it over to Drew. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the chance to talk about polarization and what we can do to address toxic polarization in our culture, in our churches, in our families, even. We are grateful for Dom here to lead us. We're grateful for Science for the Church, for Drew, and for Ed, who are here among us. And we pray, God, that this workshop in the week of the inauguration would give us hope and give us wisdom. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen. So I'm excited to introduce you or reintroduce you, if you were here at one of the other workshops, to Drew Rick Miller. Drew and I were MDiv classmates together at Princeton Seminary back in the last century, I hate to say. And he's been a good friend to me personally, but in the last couple of years since I began this role, he's been a really good friend to the Synod of the Covenant. The organization that he co-leads and co-founded is called Science for the Church. Its goal is to bring the hard sciences into the life of and social sciences into the life of church members so that they can think about what the sciences can teach us and help us about our faith in Christ. I've mentioned that it's the best newsletter that I get. I'm sure that Drew would be glad to put the registration link in the chat so that you can sign up for it if you have not already. They have led workshops that are, again, on our YouTube channel on the church, science, and race, and the church, science, and mental health. This election series, they have been leading workshops on polarization, and there were two before the election, and then this one today. Drew, we're really grateful for our partnership. We're really grateful for you, and I will turn it over to you to introduce Dom and say whatever you want to about Science for the Church. And again, I mentioned earlier, I've got to leave because I double booked myself, but I'm going to watch this workshop later. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chip. Thanks, everyone. It's good to be with you all, and I'm particularly thankful this morning that we are science for the church and not technology for the church, because we woke up this morning and our website reset to a year ago. So we may not be sharing too many links with you as we try to fix that technology glitch. It seems inevitable in science and faith conversations that something goes wrong with the technology, but feel free if you want to reach out to us. Ed and I can put our emails in the chat, and we can get you signed up for our newsletter, tell you more about our ministry, give you access to some of the resources, because right now they're a little bit difficult for us to share. So I want to welcome you all here. It's really exciting for us to be able to work with the Synod. Science for the Church exists to strengthen the church through an engagement with science and particularly with scientists. The way we do this typically and as much as possible is relationally. So we have worked with Dom Packer, our guest today, with the previous psychologists that were in this series, Kurt Gray and Daryl Von Tongeren, on multiple programs and events. We've been able to build a relationship with them and really learn about their work and try to learn the ways that it can help benefit the church. And so we're hopeful that in Dom's presentation and in our interaction today, that you'll begin to see the ways that the science that they are doing and being in relationship with individuals like them, how they can benefit you in the ministries of your congregations and your communities. I want to very briefly kind of give a summary of the last couple webinars, kind of give you a tease. How many people attended one of the prior seminars? So we have a number of you did attend those. So Kurt Gray led our first webinar. He's a psychologist at University of North Carolina. He's just come out with a book that was launched last week called Outraged. And he's really interested in how we form our deepest beliefs. And so he's done a lot of work on kind of our human ancestors and how most of us are not predators. We are more like prey. And so he believes we have common foundation in worrying, in fear, and in notions of harm. How do we prevent harm? And that this is what forms our deepest beliefs and our moral values. And what he argues is that when we differ, our differences are not in how we form our deepest beliefs, but our differences in our whom we perceive being harmed. And that's how we form these divisions. So we have a common ground, but we have differences in who we see are being harmed that leads to polarization. So that was our first webinar. And Kurt offered some tools on how to overcome that, particularly the use of personal stories, how we tell stories about our deepest values in ways that help other people understand us. And he's found in doing that work, we're actually closer than we think often when we're willing to share these personal stories. Our second leader in this webinar series was Daryl Von Tongren, who's at Hope College in Michigan, so nearby perhaps some of your churches there. And he's done extensive work on humility and looking at humility as an antidote to narcissism. He believes there's an epidemic of narcissism in our culture today, and that humility is one of the ways we can overcome that. But he's also discovered a lot of other things about humility, the ways it benefits us individually and societally, and also the way it can help us bridge divides, cultivating and developing a humble posture as a way to help us interact. So, two complementary but different perspectives. And today we're excited to have Dr. Dominic Packer from Lehigh University to share research on social psychology, and particularly in identity and group interactions is a lot of the work that he's done. Dominic is a professor and the Associate Vice Provost of Research at Lehigh. He studied at McGill University and the University of Toronto, and then did a postdoc in Columbus at the Ohio State University. He studies intergroup relations, dissent, social influence, and leadership. And with fellow social psychologist Jay Van Bavel, he recently published The Power of Us, Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. And so I think he'll be telling us quite a bit about what's in that book and some of the things they have learned both through their own research and that of their peers. So with that, I'll get to Dom's the star of the show. We want to hear and learn from Dom. He's going to present to us for a while. We're going to have some time for Q&A. Feel free to start to form your questions in chat. I think we're a small enough group here. We can also, just raise hands and have a conversation. And then I'm going to lead a little bit of a discussion afterwards to kind of help us think through. Dom has shared this information with us, and as we process, what do we begin to do with this in the church? How can this impact what we're doing within our congregations and within our communities? So thank you for joining us. And Dom, I'll let you pull up your screen and lead us from here.
Great. Thanks very much, Drew. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So yeah, I think it's interesting timing to be here talking about political polarization on January 21, right after an inauguration that we all witnessed yesterday. I spent part of my last night reading executive orders. I don't plan to get much into those today, but what I do want to talk about is largely has to do with trust and distrust and the role that these things play, among other things in polarization and some of the challenges that we see as societies at the moment. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about trust and where it comes from. This is an image that was created by one of the generative AI models a few months ago when I asked it to draw me a picture that sort of exemplifies humans trusting one another. And you can see there's this heart sort of at the center of it. Gives this impression of trust as a warm and fuzzy kind of concept. And certainly it can be. But one of the things I'm going to talk about today is that trust isn't all warm and fuzzy. There's upsides and downsides to it, and the ways in which we trust one another don't always come from sort of interpersonal, warm and fuzzy kinds of places. And there's other sources of trust as well. And in particular, what I'm going to suggest today is that human beings, when we try to figure out whether we can trust one another, work together, cooperate, collaborate, form friendships, marry one another, go into business with one another, work for each other, and so on, that we make those decisions sort of based on three possible types of trust, or there's three ways in which we figure out that we can or cannot trust one another. One way, which is actually in the middle of this figure, is what sociologists call network-based trust. A better word for it is probably it's relationships. We form relationships with each other, we get to know each other, and on the basis of repeated interactions, we figure out, oh, this is a trustworthy person, or sometimes when things haven't gone well, this is an untrustworthy person who I don't necessarily want to interact with much anymore. Second way we form trust-based relationships, and this is where I've done a lot of my research in my career, is group-based trust. So when we belong to the same groups as other people, we automatically, it turns out, start to extend trust toward them and also behave in more trustworthy ways as well. If we simply believe we share some common group identity, which could be based on shared nationality, shared occupational identity, a shared religious identity, it could be based on gender, race, ethnicity. These group-based identities, which can even be created in the lab with the flip of a coin, cause us to trust each other a little bit more. And then the third way that human beings come to trust each other is on the basis of institutions. If we have laws, we have rules, we have procedures that sort of regulate how we interact with each other, that can also foster trust. And it's a lot less personal, but it turns out to be quite important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all three of these and the implications that they have for, among other things, polarization. So we'll start with network-based trust, which is trust based on relationships, essentially. This is personalized trust and cooperation. It's personalized because we have direct experience interacting with each other. Or in some cases, we don't necessarily have that direct experience, but we know about people through their reputations. It turns out this is a major function that gossip plays for human societies, right? We gossip about each other all the time. And one of the things that gossip does, in addition to being somewhat enjoyable, perhaps a guilty pleasure, is we learn about each other, right? We learn who has done what to other people, who's behaved well, who's behaved badly. And that in turn shapes whether or not we feel we can trust someone who we haven't necessarily had direct experience with ourselves. So we get to know each other in social networks. Networks not necessarily like Facebook, but networks in that we're connected to each other. And we have these relationships and we develop trust or not based on our experiences or the experiences of others. There's really interesting science on this kind of trust. There's a suggestion, for example, that because of just limitations in our cognitive capacity, limitations of the human brain, we may sort of tap out at about groups of around 150 where we can effectively manage trust in this sort of relational kind of way. So there's an evolutionary biologist called Robin Dunbar. And what he did was he looked at the brain sizes of all sorts of different mammalian species and correlated it with the size of the groups that they tended to live in. And what he found is that you could actually plot pretty consistently prefrontal cortex size, that's the sort of part of the brain that's able to track things in sophisticated ways, to the size of the group. And so he plotted it for all these species, and when you draw the line and look at where human beings fall, you find that given the size of our brain, we should roughly be able to handle these sort of network-based relationships up to about 150 people. And if you think about it, every person you add beyond that adds exponentially to the complexity, right? So in order to have a sense of who can trust each other in a network, you need to know not just how they treat you, but how they treat each other. As you add more people, and it gets more and more complicated. And it turns out if you look at the size of groups that naturally tend to form, in terms of friendships and so on, 150 seems to be about the maximum for a human being. This sort of trust also has downsides, right? So trust we generally think of as a positive thing. We get along, we like each other, we cooperate. But when it's based on friendships, who you know, all these sort of deep interpersonal relationships, it also has negative sides, right? It's what can lead to things like nepotism, or what's sometimes called the old boys club, right? If you know the right people, then you have access, you get the information or the resources you need, you get hired. If you don't know the right people, well, just too bad for you, right? That's one of the disadvantages of this kind of network-based trust. I'm not going to say a huge amount about this form of trust, except talk a little bit about polarization in this context, but I will highlight, it's actually a really interesting book. It's called The Industry of Anonymity, which looks at how do cyber criminals come to trust each other. And it's actually a really fascinating question, because you might think that the internet was this sort of marvelous playground for criminals, right? Where because they could remain anonymous, they could exploit people, commit crimes much more easily. And there's certainly some truth to that. But it turns out to run a criminal enterprise, you have to be able to trust each other, right? You have to be able to trust that the person you're committing a crime with or funneling money through or whatever it might be isn't going to rat you out to the authorities. And that turns out to be a really hard problem to solve when you're anonymous, because if you're anonymous, nothing's to stop them from selling you out, because what would you do about it? And this book charts how do people...
I can actually mute it a little bit. I just don't like when they say, and Keith, what do you think?
How do people who are committing crimes online actually build these relationships of trust? And it turns out they often break anonymity. They actually agree to meet up in person to break the anonymity, in part so they can come to trust each other. Like, if we know who each are, then we have a sort of pact of mutual destruction, and therefore I can trust you more. This is a really famous figure from a sociologist who wrote a book called Bowling Alone. Right now I'm blanking on his name, Robert Putnam. Who made the case that in America in particular, but in general, in societies more generally, we see a decline in this sort of interpersonally based trust, that we live in an era of greater sort of separation between people. It's potentially only accelerated since 2010 when he sort of plotted this out. But he mapped it, among other things, to things like bowling leagues in the United States, which you can see peaked in the 1960s and 1970s and have been in rapid decline ever since. And his argument was that we no longer live in a society where people have deep interpersonal connections beyond their sort of nuclear or immediate families. When it comes to polarization, right, if trust based on relationships is very important for human beings, which it is, one of the things that political polarization is doing is potentially degrading these sorts of these bonds between people who would ordinarily not have great difficulty trusting or liking each other, collaborating, cooperating with each other, but because they now hold different beliefs, but not just hold different beliefs, which is always the case, but those beliefs have become central to identity, and therefore it makes it hard to interact with each other. This is just one data point. There's been a series of studies looking at how does political diversity or political polarization impact how long people spend together at Thanksgiving. And what this graph shows you is across these studies, when people are going to more politically diverse family events, where they might disagree with each other about politics, they are spending less time together at Thanksgiving than when they are going to dinners, Thanksgiving meals, where they tend to be in agreement with each other. So this effective political disagreement is changing the dynamic, even within close family relationships, where people are simply spending less time together if they disagree, at one of the most important events for Americans every year. Another place we see political polarization have a larger impact than it used to is in romantic relationships, who people choose to date and ultimately marry or form long-term bonds with. So this is data from a dating website called OkCupid. And one of the cool things about OkCupid is they collect a lot of data and then they analyze it and actually make it public. And what they found is that politics plays an increasingly large role in dating decisions. Now, this slide says 7 in 10 don't think it's a deal breaker if their date is voting for a different presidential candidate. But 30% of people saying it is a deal breaker is an increase over what it was historically, where politics didn't play a huge role in people's decisions about who to date. And when you look at longer term relationships, it's playing a larger role still. It's increasingly the case that people say, I'm not willing to spend significant time with or consider forming a romantic relationship with someone who I disagree with politically. In fact, if you look historically, right? Attitudes towards things like interracial marriage in the United States have changed dramatically since the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. So the clear majority of Americans now have no problem with interracial marriage, whereas a majority of Americans do, at least for themselves and their children, now have a problem with interpolitical marriages. They don't feel comfortable, for example, if their child was to marry someone with at least a dramatically different political orientation. So those are relationship-based forms of trust. I'm going to turn now and talk about what we call identity-based forms of trust. And this is really based on groups. And this is where most of my research has focused over the years. Group-based trust is different than relationship-based trust in that it tends to be what we call depersonalized. So in this case, I can feel like I trust someone simply because we share some common group membership and we're both aware of that, even though we don't know each other, even though we don't have a long history of working together. Even if I don't know their reputation through gossip. And it's grounded in this knowledge that we share some sort of group membership. And this turns out to be surprisingly powerful. Studies in the 1970s, for example, and I've done these in my lab as well, called the minimal group studies, take participants, they essentially flip a coin, and on the basis of the coin toss say, oh, you've been selected to be on the red team or the blue team. It's a group people have never heard of before. It's arbitrary. They don't know anyone in the group. There's no history between the groups or within them. And what you find is that within seconds, really, people like their group better than the other group. And if given the chance, they'll discriminate in favor of their group. That is, they will, if they're dividing up resources, they'll give more to their own group than to this other group that they've literally never heard of moments before. So we wrote this book called The Power of Us, my friend Jay and I, to talk about this research and to really describe how powerful groups are and the ways in which they affect our psychology and the ways we interact with each other and treat each other and ultimately build societies. And at the start of the book, we began with two quotations that really sort of between the two of them capture the fundamental message of the book. One is from John Locke, who said, "We are all the sort of chameleons that still take a tincture from things near us." And what he's saying in this is that as human beings, we are chameleon-like in that our identities and who we are is malleable. It shifts. It's not exactly the same in every circumstance. So who we are, for example, with our friends is often a little bit different than who we are with our coworkers. And that's a bit different than who we are, say, with the family that we grew up with. And that might be different still from who we are at a sports event when you're cheering for your favorite football team, right? There's a commonality across them, but the way you behave, the way you think, your preferences and so on actually do shift. And there's lots of research showing that. And the other quotation was from British author Zadie Smith, who in 2020, sort of peak pandemic, wrote a small book in which she defined identity as area of interest, as the form in which you have chosen to expend your love and your commitment. And so we have these identities. They're somewhat malleable. We're not exactly the same in every circumstance, but when we feel like we identify with a group, for example, it changes our motivations. And in particular, we come to feel like we owe something to that group, that we're motivated to pursue that in-group's interest, to do what's best for that group. And this is what's captured here. I think there's a third quotation which we can take from the Bible. This was not something we included in the book, but I think it's something that will be familiar to all of you and captures some of the sentiment of what we're talking about. So 1 Corinthians 12:12 says, "For as the body is one and hath many members, and all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ." And the idea, I think, that's captured here and that's resonant with the psychology that we investigate is that when people feel like they're part of a community, it becomes an identity. And identity is rooted in the word one. And it's as if, especially if you're strongly identified with a group, that you have become one with that group. The group's interests are now your interests. The sense of me has shifted to a sense of us, so on. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about two of my all-time favorite experiments that illustrate this sort of a point. So this is a study that was conducted in England a few years ago. And the participants in this study were football fans, or soccer fans. And in particular, they were all fans of the football club Manchester United. And of course, football fans, especially in England, don't have the best reputation, right? This sense of hooliganism and so on. And what happened in this experiment, it was an experiment that would investigate their propensity to help other people. Again, maybe not the sort of behavior you generally think of as common to football fans. So they're all fans of the club Manchester United. And the experiment takes place in 2 phases. In phase 1, they come into a lab on campus, and they're asked to complete a questionnaire. And it's a whole set of questions about themselves, personality type things. But buried in amongst these questions was a set of questions designed to highlight their identity as fans of the Manchester United Football Club. So why do you like Manchester United so much? Why is it a great football club? What's awesome about it, and so on. Having completed this questionnaire, thinking about themselves now as fans of Manchester United, they're told, well, the second part of the experiment is going to take place across campus. You need to walk across campus, go to this other lab where you'll finish up. And they're shown a map of the route. And so they set off across campus. And sure enough, lo and behold, as they're crossing campus, this young man runs out in front of them across the pathway and trips and falls to the ground and clutches his ankle in agony. And the question, of course, is, do these people, these participants walking across campus, stop to help? Do they inquire if he needs help, and so on? And there's a manipulation. There's 2 conditions in this study. In one condition, the young man who trips and falls in front of the participant is wearing a Manchester United jersey. Sorry, I should say there's actually 3 conditions. In one condition, he's wearing a Manchester United jersey. In a second condition, he's wearing a football jersey, but it's for the Liverpool Football Club. And Liverpool is the arch rivals of Manchester United. And in the third condition, he's wearing a shirt. It's just a plain white t-shirt, so there's no logo on it at all. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what they found, you can probably guess where this is going, is that the participants were significantly more likely to help, something like 80 to 90% of the time, if the person who was in pain in front of them was wearing a Manchester United shirt, so the same group as themselves. They were much less likely to help the person wearing the Liverpool shirt, but also the person wearing a plain shirt. Right, so sharing this common identity with this person made them more likely to help. So that's not a huge surprise, probably. You could probably sense where that was going. But there's a twist to this experiment. There's a whole other set of participants. Very similar design. Participants come into the lab, they complete a questionnaire. In this case, the question is a little bit different. Rather than asking questions about Manchester United, designed to activate that part of their identity, they were instead asked questions about soccer or football more generally. Why are you so interested in soccer? What is it about it that really pleases you? Why is it a beautiful game? So on. And this was designed, instead of activating this more parochial, smaller identity of Manchester United, to activate a broader identity of football fan in general. So they've completed this questionnaire. They're thinking about themselves as football fans. They cross the campus. A young man falls in front of them. Do they help? And in this case, what they found was different. What they found is that people were just as likely to help the Manchester United fan who is in pain and also the Liverpool fan. But they weren't particularly likely to help the guy wearing a shirt with no logo at all. So what does this mean? What it shows is what I was talking about before, which is identity is to some degree flexible, right? These are people, they're all fans of Manchester United, but whether or not they're thinking about themselves in that way is variable depending on the experiences they just had. And those people who are now thinking of themselves in a broader identity come to think of themselves as part of a group, not just with Manchester United fans, but also Liverpool fans who are also football fans and therefore worthy of their help and their concern. The people who are not football fans and got just wearing the plain shirt, well, they still don't get helped all that much. So that's one of my favorite studies. I'll tell you another one which sort of exemplifies the same point. In order to understand this study, we need to talk about something called a public goods game. And public goods games, they're economic games designed originally by economists to study trust and cooperative behavior. And essentially what they're designed to do, and you might have heard of these before, is look at the fundamental dynamics of something like trust and cooperation while stripping out all of the sort of noise that takes place in real life. So it's sort of like putting it in a vacuum. You've distilled it to its essence. And you can learn things from them. So in a public goods game, example, I'll tell you about, say you have a group of 4 people, and they're all given some sort of a resource at the beginning. And let's say in this case, we have 4 people, they're all given $1. They're then given a choice. They can decide whether or not they want to contribute their dollar to the group or to keep it for themselves. And they're told that if they contribute their money to the group, it will be doubled and create a collective pot of all the money that's been contributed. And so in this case, we have 4 people, and if they all choose to contribute their $1, Each dollar is multiplied by 2 and becomes a collective pool of $8. So collectively, they've essentially doubled their resources, right? They've doubled their money. It's $8 in this collective pool, whereas there was only 4 to begin. And whatever enters the collective pool is then divided equally among the 4 members. So in this case, that $8 gets divided up between the 4, and they each end up with 2. They've all doubled their money. And so clearly there's an incentive, if you can cooperate and work together, to contribute to this collective good. But there's a twist, or there's a problem with this, and this is the reason why it's called a public goods game, is that there's also an incentive not to do that. So let's imagine a different situation where we have 3 of the 4 group members, and they contribute their dollar to the group. This creates a collective pool of $6, but we have one person who defects, who doesn't contribute, who's the jerk in the group, and they keep their dollar for themselves. It doesn't enter the collective pool. Whatever's in the collective pool then gets divided up equally, but now it's $6, so everyone gets $1.50 back. But this person who defected actually does better than that. They end up with $2.50 because they have their original dollar as well as the dollar that came from the collective pool. And so the best thing for a person playing this game, right, is to actually keep the money for themselves and hope everyone else does the right thing and contributes to the group, because that's how they'll do better than everyone else. The problem is that's the incentive for everybody. So if everyone thinks that way, then nobody gives anything to the group and everyone's worse off, right? Because at the end of the day, there's only $4 among the 4 people instead of the possibility of $8. And this game has been designed to model real life circumstances like paying taxes, right? So paying taxes pays for collective goods. If we pay taxes, we have things like fire departments. We have things like roads that aren't filled with potholes. We have things like airports. These are all good. These are all things that we all benefit from. On the other hand, what's best for me is that all of you pay your taxes and I don't. I still get access to the fire department. I still can drive on the roads. I still can fly out of the airport, but I get to keep all my money and you've paid for all these positive collective goods, public goods that we share. And this is a real problem. It's the reason why you need things like the IRS to actually, in some cases, force people to pay taxes, because the incentives otherwise are not to. But if everyone thinks that way, it all falls apart and there's no public goods at all. So it turns out that in addition to being able to have people play these games, there are also personality differences in how people tend to respond in these sorts of situations. Some people tend to behave in very cooperative, altruistic ways. So not everyone defects given the opportunity. In fact, there are people called consistent contributors who, no matter what other people are doing, always give to the group. And we see this in experiments. And they're an interesting set of people, ranging between 12 to 20% of people. And there's also people who tend to be what are called competitive, or sometimes called pro-selfs. That is, the way they respond tends to be more selfish. They tend not to care about outcomes to others and consistently do what's best for themselves. So in this experiment, the participants were college students, and they were going to play a public goods game with other college students. But before they did so, they completed a personality test to determine whether or not, when they do these sorts of things, when they think about dividing up resources or making decisions, do they tend to do them in ways that are selfish, or what are called pro-selfs, or do they tend to do it in ways that are relatively selfless, oriented toward others' considerations? Now, what this graph shows is how many people contributed to a public good in the sort of game I was just showing you, depending on whether they were a pro-social or a pro-self. But there's a twist. In this case, before they played the public goods game, which were they were going to play with other students, they completed a questionnaire. And in some cases, the questionnaire focused on very individual things. What are your personality traits? What do you like as an individual? In other cases, the questionnaire asked them to think about their identity as a college student, highlighting their connection to these people they were about to then play a game with. And so what the graph shows you is how they ultimately responded in the game. And if you look at the pro-socials, not a huge surprise. Pro-socials tended to behave pro-socially, that is, contribute to the public good, regardless of whether they're thinking of themselves as an individual or as a group member. But for pro-selves, it's really different. For these people who are thinking of themselves as individuals, which is called low group identification, they don't contribute nearly as much. Less than 50% of these people actually contribute to the public good. But for pro-selves who are thinking of themselves as group members, right? The shared identity with other college students has been highlighted for them before they play the game. they actually look much more like pro-socials. They are consistently, about 80% of the time, giving to the public good. And what the researchers and I would argue is that it's not that these pro-selves have become less selfish, it's that the self has shifted. The self temporarily, for them, now includes the group. Right? The group of fellow college students is attached to the self, and so they behave in a way that's actually self-oriented, in this case, by contributing to the group. I don't expect they contribute much to outgroups, but they are contributing consistently to this in-group when they're thinking of themselves as a group member in that way. So in both cases, what these studies are highlighting is that our identities are malleable, right? You can think of yourselves in one way and it does change how you behave. And one of the key things that happens when we think about ourselves as group members is we become in-group interested. We start to preference the group. We start to treat in-group members better. We trust them more and we behave in more trustworthy ways. We cooperate with each other. I think I'll skip this slide. Or maybe I won't because it helps make a point. So group identities turn out to be really essential when it comes to cooperation and trust, helping us figure out who it is we can trust. And there's a bit of an interesting twist to it because it's not just that I will trust people who I know I share a group membership with because I happen to like them more. I will only trust people who I share a group membership with when I know that they also know we share the group membership. Because if I think that they don't know that we share the group membership, then why would they necessarily treat me well? So this is an experiment where we put people in groups. We had them make various sort of trust-based decisions with in-group partners and out-group partners. And in every case, the participants in these studies know that they share or don't share a group membership with the person they're playing this game with. But in some cases, they knew that the person they played the game with also shared that knowledge and knew that they were both in the same group. But in other cases, they knew that the person they were playing the game with didn't know, was not aware that they in fact shared a group membership. So I know we're part of the same group, but I know that you don't know that. In that case, I can't necessarily infer that you will treat me better than you otherwise would, that you would actually behave more in a more trustworthy way toward me. And what these data show is that people did trust in-group members more, but it is shaped by whether or not that identity is truly shared or shared knowledge. So if we don't share the knowledge that we possess the same group, what you can see for in-group partners is people who are somewhat less trusting toward that in-group member. Even though we share a group membership, I can't expect you necessarily to treat me better because you just don't know we share a group membership. And this has interesting implications because it suggests it's one of the reasons why human beings are so eager to signal their identities to others, right? So if you think about the apparel industry, things like sports-based fandom apparel or affiliation with universities, it turns out it's a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry, in part, I would argue, because it serves a signaling function, right? If you're wearing an Eagles shirt, it signals to other Eagles fans that, hey, we're part of the same group. If you've gone to a university and you wear, as an alumni, the shirt or a logo from that university, it signals to other alums who you might meet in any situation that, hey, we're part of the same group, and makes trusting or cooperating, working together a little bit easier. People put flags on their backpacks, right, as they travel overseas. And we tell a story in the book, my friend Jay and I, of times when we, as teenagers, were traveling on exchange programs, we had Canadian flags on our backpacks. And in the most random of places, bumped into other people who had Canadian flags on our backpacks and immediately felt a bit of a bond, right? Simply because we shared this common identity. And you might make the case, I don't know if there's specific research on this, that this is one of the reasons why people wear religious symbols, right? Once again, it sends a signal to other members of that community that, hey, we're part of the same community. So that's identity-based trust. It's very much grounded in groups that we belong to. We have to have shared knowledge. It can lead to many wonderful things. The ability to form groups, I think, is one of human beings' superpowers. It enables us to do really extraordinary things we could never do as individuals. But there's a downside to it as well. So we saw that with relationship-based trust, a downside is things like nepotism. With identity-based trust, or group-based trust, the pathologies are parochialism or discrimination, prejudice, bias, right? We like our own groups more than we like other groups. This is a very common pattern. And I think we're all familiar or aware of the ways in which that can cause significant problems in a society. And at the moment, to turn back to polarization, we see significant problems with politically based identities driving people's preferences and their treatment of each other. So these are data collected through 2020, which measured people's opinions both toward their own political party as well as the out party, the party they were not affiliated with. And what shows up is actually a really interesting pattern over time. So they're completing these ratings of what's called a feeling thermometer, where you rate these groups from I feel very cold toward them, I feel very warm toward them. And what you can see on the top graph is that people's opinions toward the in-party, their own political affiliation, have remained pretty constant over time. So people feel warm, relatively speaking, toward their own political affiliation. And that's true in 1980, and it's true in 2020. What's changed over time rather dramatically is people's opinions toward or feelings about the other political party, the other side of the spectrum. And what you can see in 1980 is that people's feelings toward the out party were characterized as neutral. That is, they felt they liked their own group better, but the other group was fine. What's changed and consistently over time, you can see by 2020, is that people's opinions toward the out party have become significantly more negative. So they're not feeling more positively about their own political party, but what they are feeling is significantly more negative about the other side of the political spectrum. And some researchers, and there's debate about this, but some researchers are arguing that out-party hate is now a stronger force for many voters than in-party love. And I think we hear this rhetorically when you hear people say, well, I'm not voting for anyone. I don't like any of the candidates, but I'm definitely voting against this person, right? Like they can't win. Anyone would be better than them. And that's a motive driven by a dislike rather than a like for your own particular political preference. And so this is a change. It is a change in the relationship based on political identities. It turns out when people do experiments, for example, with the minimal groups I was describing before, where you randomly assign people to a new group, the pattern is almost always one of in-group love, but not out-group dislike or hate. That is, it looks like we felt politically in the 1980s, where we like our own groups a bit more, but we don't particularly dislike the out-group. It's only when you add serious competition, serious negative stereotyping, hostile rhetoric from leaders, and so on, that you get this pattern we see in 2020, where the in-group's fine, but the out-group we really dislike. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about institution-based trust. So this is another form of depersonalized trust, right? We trust each other, not because we know each other, not because we share a group membership, but because we're sort of subject to a common set of rules or procedures or structures that help to regulate our interactions. We're aware that there's a set of rules. I trust that people are generally going to obey them. Therefore, I can go into a restaurant. I feel comfortable handing over my credit card to a stranger, someone I've never met, probably don't share a group membership with, because I know that there's a set of rules in place that make it very unlikely they're going to rip me off, that they're going to take my number, charge things to my card. And I know if that does happen, because it does happen very occasionally, there's actually procedures in place to protect me, that the credit card companies tends to deny those charges or pay me back, right? It allows me to hand over my credit card without really even thinking about it. And that is an act of trust, but it's very different than trusting someone because they're part of a group that I share or because I know that person. I'll skip this. The kinds of things that can produce this kind of trust include governments, corporate structures, the legal system, contract law, property rights, the insurance system, stock markets. These are all things that they're very impersonal, but they create a system in which we generally feel we can trust each other. And there's lots of interesting examples of how this it has evolved over time in human societies. One thing that you tend to see in institutions over time is that they professionalize. So when I go to the doctor or hire a lawyer, the reason I trust them with my health or with my legal situation is that I believe, and generally speaking it's true, that they have taken part in significant period of education where they learned all the rules and they know what they're doing, that they've been professionalized to do what they're doing. So I don't question my doctor when she says, there's a problem with your knee. And I don't question my lawyer when they say, this is the way we'll argue this case. And that's a shift that's occurred in American and other societies over time. So 1800, for example, there were only 3 law schools in the United States. By 1900, there's 50. And now there's, I don't know how many, hundreds. Medical, if you look at the trajectory of medical school in the United States, in 1900, medical programs were 2-year programs. By 1950 and in the present, they are at minimum 4-year programs, right? Indicating this degree of professionalization where we trust a doctor, we trust a lawyer, not because we know them, not because they're part of the same group as us, but because they have been socialized into an institution that has a set of procedures that make it very predictable and ideally accurate in how these people do their work. There's cool cross-national studies that look at how institutions create trust among people in societies. So there's a study, for example, which tracked people for 18 years in Denmark. What they found was that Danish citizens' trust in social institutions, like their trust in the government, trust in the police, and so on, predicted how much they trusted each other as individuals, what's called interpersonal trust, but didn't go the other way around. So trusting each other as individual Danes did not predict their trust for the government. So trusting the government helped create an atmosphere in which you felt you could trust each other as citizens. Similarly, if you look at people who immigrate to new countries, how their what's called generalized trust, their sense that people are generally trustworthy, what you find is that their feelings of trust toward other individuals are associated positively, both with how trustworthy was the society they came from, but also the society, or excuse me, the institutions of their new country. So people who come from a more corrupt country into a less corrupt country ultimately end up trusting individuals in that country more because they're being shaped by the institutions, right? If it feels like we have a good rule of law, for example, it feels like generally people are going to follow the rules, they're going to follow the laws. If they don't, they'll be punished and I'll get restitution. Therefore, I can generally trust people regardless of whether I share a group membership with them or I know them personally. Now, one of the problems with this kind of research for a scientist is it's very correlational, right? So we can look at how things work in Denmark, but you have to ask questions about, like, is this specific to Denmark? And is there something else that could be causing the relationship between these things? It's very hard to look at institutions experimentally. But there's actually one very interesting recent exception to that. This was done in the country of Benin, where Benin was undergoing a period of land reform. And in particular, what was happening in Benin in villages was it was going from a system which was highly nepotistic for the allocation of land. Essentially, you got land based on who you knew. And if you were connected to the powerful people, you got more land than if you weren't. And this land reform initiative was designed to make the allocation of land much more systematic, rigorous, and merit-based, right? So it's not who you know, it's based on a set of objective criteria. But the people instituting these reforms did something really interesting in that they instituted them in a randomized control trial. That is, they randomly selected a set of places where these land reforms would occur first, and a set of places where they wouldn't occur for some period of time. So they could see what was the effect of actually introducing these institutions that make allocation of land much more fair and impartial on things like trust. And what the graph shows you is that the treated locations, that is the places where land reform was instituted first, when people were assessed for how much they were willing to extend trust and cooperate with other people, those places exhibited significantly more trust. Right? So having a set of fair and impartial institutions that worked well for the allocation of land increased the degree to which people in these areas trusted each other. So these are institutions. They also have pathologies, right? They can be rigid or impersonal to the point of dehumanization. So unlike trust based on who I know you, we're friends, or we're part of the same group, trusting you simply because we're all subject to the tax code isn't exactly sort of warm and fuzzy in the way that I was talking about at the beginning. And we all know of institutions, you can think about trying to renew your driver's license in some places, right, that are just so impersonal, so based in the rules that they are completely unhelpful, and it feels like you're not being treated as a human, right? You're just a cog in the machine. Institutions can also bake in bias and discrimination, and there's lots of evidence, right, that institutions, including legal institutions, are biased in the way that they get, either the ways the laws are written or the ways the laws get implemented. They can ossify. Institutions can become stuck. they used to work, in the 1700s when they were designed. Maybe they don't work so well with the challenges of generative AI in 2020, and so on. And when we talk about institutions and the role they play in trust, and we think especially about polarization, to return to that, right? I think we're living in a kind of dangerous or troubling time, right? If you look at, for example, trust in the government, a very important institution in the United States, we see that since the 1950s, there's been a very steady decline in trust in the government. And this decline isn't just trust in the government, it's actually mirrored by trust in pretty much every major institution in the United States. There are political differences when we talk about polarization, right? So people's views of important institutions are to some degree linked and potentially shaped by their politics. So you can see the US Supreme Court, for example, and these are fairly recent data, I think from 2023, is trusted by significantly more Republicans than independents or Democrats. You can see that trust in the church, particularly relevant to this group, right, is significantly higher among Republicans than independents and Democrats. But even among Republicans, it's actually not 50% or more, right? It's only 49%. So the church, among other institutions, has seen significant declines in the degree to which people trust it, or trust churches or religious organizations as institutions. Another example of how politics has infused this form of trust, and this is actually one of my favorite figures, just because it's so stark, is trust in things like law enforcement, especially the FBI. Now, historically, if you look at the American population, and this would go back for a very long time, right? Historically, citizens on the right tend to trust law enforcement significantly more than citizens on the left. And so if you look at attitudes toward the FBI, and this would date back from the founding of the FBI, right? The typical Republican voter would report trusting the FBI significantly more than the average Democrat. And what you can see on this graph is that that's the pattern that's exemplified toward trust in the FBI, all the way up to the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, when you can see things that diverge very dramatically. And that point of divergence is when Trump fired James Comey, head of the FBI. At which point you can see Democrats immediately start to trust the FBI more, and Republicans who support President Trump at the time start to dramatically trust the FBI less, right? And this is really, to the average voter, nothing about what the FBI is doing, right? It's not changing the day-to-day work of the FBI. It's political, right? It's the head of the political party has signaled his preference or feelings toward this institution, and that's shaping then for the attitudes of these voters. Okay, so we have these three forms of trust, or sources of trust, or ways in which we come to trust each other based on relationships, based on shared group identities, and based on institutions. And I think when we think about religious organizations, it's very interesting because religious institutions or religious groups sort of hit on all three aspects of trust, are sort of really important in all three ways, right? So when you talk to people who are religious, sure, we can have further conversation about this. I mean, one of the common things that you hear, right, is that people are attracted to churches or synagogues or mosques in part for the community, right? It's the social relationships that they find there. They form bonds with each other simply by coming together on a regular basis. Friendships emerge, close relationships form. People find romantic partners and partners for life in these contexts, right? There's a very relational aspect to it. And you see a lot of, for example, helping behavior that's based on those interpersonal relationships. We did studies, for example, during the pandemic and found that for many Americans, the most important identity as society sort of collapsed around them temporarily were their religious identities. And when asked why, it's because that's where they could turn for help, right? They knew people there. They knew they had friends there who would be available to them in these hard times. So that's part of it. Religions are also shared identities, right? There's a sense that if you belong to the same denomination or the same general set of beliefs, or maybe even the same large-scale monotheistic religion, right, that there's a connection simply based on that shared membership in a group. And we did studies actually a very long time ago, which showed that for people who were members of religious communities, there was a distinction between feeling like you shared beliefs with people and feeling like you shared a group with people, and that both mattered. But the group does matter to people. The fact that we're part of the same group, we belong to the same church or the same religious community, it's a source of connection, it's a source of belonging, and it's a source of trust. And then, of course, churches serve as institutions, right? Each denomination has a set of rules and procedures and principles that govern all sorts of things, ranging from how the money works to who holds what kind of position in the organization, and so on. And institutionally, at least as a general rule, churches, like pretty much every other major institution, has seen a decline in that form of trust that presumably has a significant impact on the behaviors and the feelings and the experiences of the people who attend. So those are my general remarks. I'd love to have a conversation and hear what you think about it and answer any questions if I can, and just extend a thank you at this point to my co-author, Jay, who helped me do much of this thinking, as well as our students and collaborators who've done a lot of the work over the years. So with that, I'll stop sharing and we can have a discussion.
Thanks, Dom. And let's open it up. If I may, while others are forming questions in chat or raising hands, I'm going to go ahead and ask you the first question. My sense in this presentation is that trust plays a key role, not just in the current polarization. Does it also play a key role in overcoming polarization? And is there some kind of statement we should be thinking about of how to cultivate trust across these divides? And are there some best practices you can share for that? I'd love to. I think a lot of us are hoping from this engagement with you and others, what are tools we can learn to begin to build bridges in whether it's our polarization in our families, our churches, or between our churches, within our communities? Is there something on the trust side that we can do to begin to build those bridges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so if we think about the three sort of sources or ways in which we come to trust each other, you can think about things related to all of them that could make a difference, right? And so, on the relationship side, opportunities for people to actually get to know each other seem to be pretty crucial, right, to helping people bridge divides. And I think, you had this, you did one of these events with Kurt Gray, and I think that's the message from a lot of his work, right? So he talks a lot about it, and they have really interesting data showing that when people share stories with each other about their own experiences and their own difficulties and their own troubles, it creates empathy. It creates a sense of connection that's stronger than simply trying to convince each other of why I'm right and why you're wrong, or what I believe and what you believe, right? If we can tell stories, it helps to create that sense of connection. And to me, that speaks a lot to how it's important to probably first try and build the relationship before trying to get into the politics, right? The stories that he has people share, they're often about negative things like struggles that people have had in their lives, but they're not really about the politics, right? You build a sense of connection to someone, and then you can have a space, right? Because you already have some level of trust built up where you can say, well, actually, I don't understand why you think this way on this issue, or here's my perspective. And on the foundation of a bit of trust, those conversations tend to go significantly better. I think one piece of advice, if, so many people have been struggling in the last few years, talking to family members, you can think about those Thanksgiving dinners that are really awkward. And there's this real propensity, and I feel it myself, to want to dive right into it and talk about why we disagree. That's not the best way to do it, right? It'd be better to start the Thanksgiving dinner by talking about the things we like about each other, the things why we love each other as a family, what our commonalities are. And then maybe over dessert, we talk about some of the trickier stuff and say, but that foundation, I think, would make a big difference. I think a sense of shared group membership can be really helpful. It's tricky to inculcate. In some cases, we're so divided at this point that people are very cynical about it. But there's a huge amount of research in social psychology and beyond, which shows that if you can help people see that although they're part of separate groups, they belong to some larger group that unites them, it does make a big difference. So these are often called superordinate groups. And there's many, many studies which show that whether it's about race, right? So you have white participants and black participants, or gender, male and female, or different religious groups, or in one case, it's groups of boys competing at summer camp in this classic experiment. that if they come to see themselves as part of a larger group collectively, then they start to be more cooperative. They start to trust each other more, and it can lead to good things. So in the political context, right, it certainly used to be the case that a sense of shared American identity could trump, under some circumstances, more parochial political identities, like I'm a Democrat and you're a Republican, or vice versa. It feels like that's been lost to some degree. We have a harder time invoking that shared identity at the moment. 9/11 is a really interesting example of where it was very powerful. So this, attack on the country created for a while a very strong sense of shared identity. It showed up in interesting ways in George W. Bush's presidential approval ratings. Prior to 9/11, as you might expect, right, that Republicans were significantly more approving of him than Democrats. After 9/11, George W. Bush achieved within days the highest ever recorded approval rating of a president, not because of anything he'd done, right? Simply because he was our president. And that was true on both the right and the left. The country, for a period of time, really did unify around this common threat. It's a bit unfortunate, I think, psychologically, that one of the things that does unify groups is common threats. And sometimes those threats are other groups. Right. So people often have claimed, and I think there's some truth to this, that one of the reasons why polarization is worse now than it was, say, in the 1980s and before, is that during the Cold War, we had a common enemy, right? The Soviet Union was enough of a threat to make Americans feel American, despite party level differences. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, not so clear what the common enemy is. Jay and I, we thought, I think wrongly, that the COVID-19 pandemic could serve as a common threat in the same sort of way. Not a human enemy, right? But this disease which threatened the whole globe, maybe that could unite people, not just nationally, but maybe even internationally. We didn't see much of that happening, at least in the United States. It did happen, interestingly, in other countries, in some cases. National identity in Canada increased quite dramatically. New Zealand increased, not in the United States. And I think largely had to do with the reaction of leaders, right? Politicians chose not to make that a moment of unity, but instead a moment of disunity. And I think that highlights something about group identities and leadership, which is that leaders play a huge role. And I would say, as leaders in a religious organization, you play a huge role in helping people see what the identities are, right? And can cast it, this is a moment for unity or not. And then institutions, again, are an opportunity. I think one of the reasons I care deeply about trying to improve the fairness of institutions, like things like the legal system, is that I think when they're not fair, it makes trusting each other a lot harder. The fact that we see significant disparities, for example, based on race in legal outcomes, means that as a nation, it's going to be really hard to deal with some of the distrust and dislike between racial groups, because some groups are objectively being treated differently by our social institutions. And that, social psychology, how much you know about social psychology, we've tended to focus a lot on changing hearts and minds. That's a huge amount of work in our field on persuasion, right? If only we could get people to like each other more, things would improve. I've come to the conclusion that while that matters, unless we deal with some of the more structural things, that's not really going to work, right? That just because people temporarily like each other a bit more doesn't mean we've solved the problems that we need to solve to really create a foundation for trust for the long term.
That's helpful. So Jean has asked a question, when does a group become a silo?
That's a really good question. I think, yeah, that's a really interesting question. When does a group become a silo? So one of the things we talk about in our book is we have a whole chapter on essentially cults, or at least cult-like groups. And if you think about a cult is a group that's essentially become completely siloed, right? So if someone joins a cult, there's often very clear, very deliberative procedures to sort of isolate that individual from all their prior connections, all the other group memberships. So don't talk to your family anymore. If possible, quit your job and spend all of the time on the compound, right? Like there's a real attempt to create an insulated world where the worldview typically of some charismatic leader is really all that you've got, right? And you can think about cults that we've all heard about. And some groups sort of, although they're not literally cults, can sort of approach that. And one interesting example we've talked about in the book and that people have written about is the company Enron, which, as Enron imploded in scandal, was described by many as a cult-like organization where they'd become so insular, they'd stopped in any way thinking about the broader implications of what they were doing. It was all right to basically do dodgy accounting within the organization because they never looked outside the organization to see any other standard, right? Everyone else was either an enemy or an idiot, not making enough money, so therefore not worth paying attention to. And so you develop this completely aberrant set of standards within an organization where the average employee, I would argue, really thought they were doing good, right? They weren't trying to rip people off. It's just the worldview they were inculcated in at that point. That was the definition of what it meant to do good. I think that there's probably a continuum from groups that are like that on the extreme to groups that are not at all like that. And one of the things we talk a lot about in the book, and it's something I didn't highlight in the presentation, is that if you want to understand how group members will behave, it's really a combination of how invested do they feel in the group and what are the norms of that group. Because strongly identified group members will follow the norms. But the norms can be many things. They can be highly insular. We don't pay attention to what other people are doing. We're number one. Don't listen to anyone else. Everyone else is an idiot. We're great. Or they can be much more humble than that, right? The norms of this group can be, we strive for accuracy, or we strive to be empathetic. We strive to be humble. We strive to help others. We strive to put other groups first, right? And I think when we look at religious communities, it's that set of norms, especially when you look at the origins of religious communities, that were what made them stand out, that made them different from any other groups, was right. We have a set of norms that put other people first rather than ourselves. And then people who identify strongly with that, that's how they behave. They don't behave in a parochial, discriminatory way. They behave actually in a much more community-oriented, other sort of facing kind of way. So it really is about norms. And I think when we think about silos, norms have a lot to do with it. And to leave it back to politics, I think we're just at a bit of an unfortunate period where the norms, both on the left and the right, have become pretty insular, right? We've got these echo chamber-like communities where people are really only talking to themselves. Certainly social media has played a role there. The algorithms feed people what they want. What they want is defined by what they click on. And we know that people tend to have things like confirmation biases where they seek out information that confirms what they already think. And so if that's the algorithm, if that's what you're exposed to, you're sort of creating these silos, not because anyone necessarily means to, but they can really naturally occur. And it's definitely the incentives of these media organizations to feed people what they think they want, whether or not it's what's best for them.
Other questions?
Dom, as a person who's part of one of those media organizations, I am still captured by the power of storytelling. I think the main strength to a person telling his or her story is that it is their story. It's authentic to them. And all you can really do is get out of the way and help them tell their story because it's meaningful to them. It helped to form them. And you just tell their story and try and share it with as many people as you can.
I 100% agree. I think stories are hugely powerful. We're actually starting to really dive into that in how we communicate science as well, right? So if you talk to the average scientist, right, the natural inclination is that the most important thing is the data, right? It's the facts, it's the statistics, it's the numbers, it's the quantitative aspect. But it turns out if you're going to actually try to convince people to get vaccinated or that you should stop smoking, or even that the science is important and worthy of support through public funding, the data doesn't really move most people. It is the stories. And so, for example, we brought in to my university a few months ago, this group from the Alan Alda Institute, I think it's called. So Alan Alda has invested a huge amount of his later career in science communication, doing documentaries and so on. But among other things, he's created this institute which trains science communicators, including scientists themselves, to tell better stories. And so we had them come to campus. It was a 2-day event that I participated in. It was all about storytelling. It was like, forget the data, and tell us the story that underlies this as to why it's important and interesting and impactful. And it was hugely important and useful.
Yeah, I found this to be an area where there's now some interesting connection between the Christian community and science, because the Christian community is so rooted in story.
Yep.
The stories both of individuals, but also the stories that are foundational to our tradition and our belief system. So it's bridging data into a storytelling context is a lot harder than bridging stories into a storytelling context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions? So as we start to transition towards wrapping up, was there a profound moment as you were listening to Dom's presentation, something that you're chewing on? How do I take this back into my ministry, into my congregation? Is there something you're wanting to do differently, or a way that you want to integrate some of this knowledge into your ministry? How are you starting to kind of process this? I know it's a lot of information, quite a bit of data on some of those slides as well, but how are folks beginning to process things? So for me here, interacting with Dom and hearing some of his presentations, I think very differently about the way Jesus in many of the stories reached outside of his group, the Jewish group, and reached to outsiders in caring for them. In some ways, it mirrors some of the dynamics of the studies, the social group studies that Dom presented, and can be an interesting conversation partner with that. Molly has a question here. Are there tricks to avoid an endless serialization of stories? How does one move a group toward another?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in Kurt Gray's research on stories, right, it's about people interacting with each other and telling stories to each other. And I think in that context, right, the story is sort of the entryway. It's the thing that builds that feeling of empathy and sense of connection that then allows you to transition to other sorts of conversations. And so I think in that case, it's not just an endless telling of stories. We're using stories in some way strategically to find some sort of sense of whether shared identity or a common experience that can provide a bit of a foundation. When it comes to groups, groups have sort of foundational stories they tell, right? And it's really clear in the case of religion, right? And where, especially in the New Testament, right? Jesus, all of the parables are stories, right? And they became foundational to the church, and they're told again and again. I think, and that repetition clearly serves a really important purpose. Everyone knows them. They're common points of reference. They're touchstones, so you can, with the simple, simply refer to the loaves and the fishes, and everyone knows what you're talking about, and evokes this common meaning. And that serves a really important function. And I think for groups, it's worth thinking about what are those foundational stories that you want to tell again and again? And are they the ones you really want to be telling? And maybe that doesn't apply so much to churches, but I think about organizations. I think that's really critical, right? What stories do the leaders tell about who we are? And are those exclusionary or inclusionary? Are they really about who we want to be? And being intentional about that, I think, is really important. So I think serialization, like if we're just telling stories to entertain, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very important thing for humans. We love stories. But if you're doing it in a strategic way to shape your identity, then I think telling the same story actually is very important. and telling it repeatedly. Like that reinforces there's something meaningful about this, and we can use it as a sort of touchstone. I see a question. Are we sharing the slides? Yeah, I can share the slides for sure.
Yeah, we'll make sure he'll send them to Chip, and then Chip can send them out to everyone that's registered. And again, this is being recorded, so you can rewatch it on YouTube for sure. Diane, did I see you getting ready to raise your hand and wanting to ask a question or make a comment?
It's not very well formulated in my head, but I was thinking about the relationship between identity and institution, or identity and symbol, and how an institution or a symbol like the cross might start out with a certain understanding or definition or norm, and that is actually changed by the group think. I don't know if that makes sense. But it's, as a pastor, thinking about the cross and what the cross means. The cross has been manipulated wildly in flags and in language. And so I'm not sure how to disconnect the cross. Does that make sense? Like things have merged in an unhelpful way.
I agree. I think, yes, they can merge in unhelpful ways. I think a good example of that is the American flag, right, which has become so strongly associated with the political right. At least where I live, if you see a truck driving around with a flag flying off it, you immediately assume someone who's conservative. But that's, I think, a real shame. I don't think that's a good thing. So I'm American, but also Canadian. And certainly when I was living in Canada, there was no association with the Canadian flag in politics. It really did represent the nation. That has changed. I go back now, and you see a Canadian flag again on a car, it's almost certainly a conservative. And I don't think that's a healthy thing. I think there's symbols that are really meant to exemplify larger identities, whether it's the nation or a religious belief, that are being sort of co-opted. And I do think it's important, this is just a personal thing, I've not to ground it in research, but to resist that a bit, right? To say, no, this is our symbol. Like we can all fly the flag or all wear the cross and not just give it up. I think that's really.
Yeah, and it even happens with labels. I mean, you don't hear as much of it anymore, but 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of discussion among evangelicals. Do we want to use that label? The label evangelical had been co-opted by a subset of evangelicals. So it even happens, kind of with the terminology we use to refer to ourselves. So I would, on the kind of storytelling piece, I would refer people to Kurt Gray's book, Outraged. He did a presentation last week with us and kind of outlined his model for how to tell these stories. And it's very pastoral. It's connect with people. He used kind of a civil acronym, the CIV, to have civil conversations. Connect with people, invite people to tell their stories, and then to validate them. So not to push your stories or your perspective, your view, how do I correct you? But very much like we're trained as pastors to, pastorally, to really listen and to validate people's experiences. And then if we can orient ourselves in that way, I think that's a powerful way to build some of these bridges. And I think some of Daryl's work on humility, how do we have kind of a humble approach in the way that we do that? And Kurt tells some really powerful stories of being in car rides with people of very different, political persuasion than himself, and him beginning to connect and being able to say that comment was unfair, and the person retreating back and saying, you know what, you're right, that was unfair. I should not have made that comment. I'm sorry about that. And beginning to connect in something as short as a car ride, to or from an airport. Any other last questions for Dom, or last comments? All right, we will wrap up now. I want to thank you, Dom, for sharing all this interesting research and your time and your insights with us. And thank you all for participating. And I hope between the slides and the video recordings, we will try when our website is back up. We've got interviews with Dom that are, he and I had a conversation that went a very different direction than some of the research he shared here. So there's richness there as well as the programs we did with the other psychologists that were part of the series. We hope to make that available to you and to be a resource to you in your ministries. These are difficult days with the polarization, and it's our hope that this can be a blessing on your work to build bridges across those divides. So thank you all for coming. Thanks, Dom.
Thank you all. Bye.